A puppy had 30 seconds before being put down, when a tiny kitten leapt into his cage and changed everything. What was supposed to be his last moment turned into the beginning of a fight no one saw coming. Because this wasn't just about saving a puppy, it was about exposing secrets someone powerful never wanted the world to know. As the clock ticked down, a volunteer had to make an impossible choice: risk everything to save two helpless lives, or walk away and let them vanish forever. But what she didn't realize is that these animals carried a truth so shocking it could destroy the man who ran the shelter. Now, danger is closing in, and survival will depend on loyalty, courage, and one breathtaking act of defiance. What hidden secret connects this kitten to the very man who wanted them gone? And how far would you go to save a life with only seconds left? Your presence here is powerful. In a world full of noise, it's the quiet gestures of compassion that truly stand out. If your heart still makes room for kindness, you're already one of us. The fluorescent lights buzzed harshly overhead in the Kentucky Rural Animal Shelter, casting a sickly glow across the cold, concrete floor. The morning air held a sharp, antiseptic smell that couldn't quite mask the underlying sense of fear and despair. In the last cage of the long row, a small reddish-brown puppy pressed himself against the back wall, his thin frame trembling. Rusty, as the shelter staff had named him, was barely 6 months old. His patchy fur revealed the neglect he'd endured, and his wide brown eyes darted nervously between the faces that passed his cage. Above his kennel hung a bright red tag that seemed to glow like a stoplight in the harsh fluorescent lighting. On it, 2 simple words spelled out his fate: 30 seconds. The shelter worker approached with practiced efficiency, her footsteps echoing in the quiet morning. Her face was carefully blank as she prepared the syringe, the routine so familiar she could have done it with her eyes closed. This was just another Tuesday morning, just another unwanted animal, just another necessary task. A few feet away, Marianne Holloway stood with her hands clenched at her sides. Her worn work clothes and tired eyes made her blend into the background of the shelter, just as she had for the past year as a volunteer. But today, something inside her was screaming. She watched the worker approach Rusty's cage, feeling helpless against the machinery of the system she'd begun to question more and more. "Wait," Marianne whispered, though she knew it wouldn't make a difference. The word caught in her throat, too quiet to even reach the worker's ears. The metallic click of the cage door opening seemed unnaturally loud. Rusty pressed himself even harder against the wall, making himself as small as possible. His whole body shook, but he didn't make a sound, as if he knew that crying out wouldn't change anything. That's when it happened. In the cage next door, a small grey tabby kitten had been watching everything with sharp green eyes. As the worker reached for Rusty, the kitten, known as Willow, suddenly sprang into action. Her tiny paws worked furiously at the bars separating the cages, finding the small gap where the metal had worn away. "Hey!" the shelter worker called out, startled as Willow squeezed through the gap with determined flexibility. Before anyone could react, the kitten had leaped into Rusty's cage. Instead of attacking or hiding, Willow did something that made everyone in the room freeze. She walked right up to the trembling puppy and pressed her small body against his, purring loud enough to be heard across the room. Rusty's reaction was immediate and stunning. His trembling slowed, then stopped. His frightened eyes softened as he looked down at the tiny kitten who had chosen to comfort him in what should have been his final moments. Slowly, carefully, he lowered his head to rest it gently against Willow's grey fur. The shelter worker stood with the syringe still in her hand, mouth slightly open. "I've never," she started, then stopped, shaking her head in disbelief. Marianne stepped forward, finding her voice at last. "Look at them," she said, her quiet words carrying a strength she didn't know she possessed. Just look. The scene before them defied everything they thought they knew about cats and dogs, about natural enemies, about the cold realities of shelter life. Willow had curled herself around Rusty's neck like a living collar, her purring growing louder as the puppy relaxed against her. They were two unwanted creatures finding comfort in each other, challenging the very system that had condemned them. For Marianne, the moment crystallized everything she'd been feeling but hadn't dared to voice. Every questionable practice she'd witnessed, every decision that had seemed too harsh, too quick, too final. It all came together in the tableau before her. This wasn't just about a cat and a dog. This was about challenging what everyone had accepted as necessary and normal. The worker lowered the syringe, her professional detachment cracking. "I've worked here for 8 years," she said slowly, "and I've never seen anything like this." Other shelter staff had gathered now, drawn by the commotion. They stood in a loose circle around the cage, watching as Willow groomed Rusty's ear with gentle determination, while the puppy's tail gave a tentative wag, his first since arriving at the shelter. "We can't," Marianne said, her voice stronger now. "We just can't." Everyone knew what she meant. The red tag above the cage seemed to mock them all now, its brutal simplicity challenged by the complex reality of what they were witnessing. Willow had done more than just interrupt a routine euthanasia. She had forced them all to see the individual lives behind the statistics, the beating hearts behind the paperwork. The shelter director, attracted by the unusual gathering, pushed through the small crowd. "What's the holdup? We have a schedule to keep." But even as she spoke, Willow raised her head and fixed the director with a steady, green-eyed stare, while Rusty pressed closer to his unexpected protector. The kitten's purring never faltered, filling the sterile space with the sound of unconditional love and defiance. The morning light had begun to streak through the high windows, casting golden bars across the cage floor. In that light, Rusty's reddish-brown fur glowed warmly, and Willow's grey coat turned silver. They looked transformed, no longer unwanted strays, but beings worthy of life, of love, of a chance. Marianne felt something shift inside her, like a key turning in a lock. She had always been the quiet one, the one who followed rules, the one who tried to work within the system even when it hurt. But watching Willow and Rusty, seeing how one small act of courage could change everything, she knew she couldn't stay quiet anymore. The red tag hung above them like a judgment, but its power had been broken by the simplest of things: compassion, connection, and the courage to defy expectations. In that moment, as morning light filled the shelter and two unlikely friends huddled together in defiance of their fate, everything changed. The chain of events that would challenge the entire system had begun with a tiny leap of faith from a brave grey kitten who refused to let death have the final word. The fluorescent lights buzzed harshly overhead in the Kentucky rural animal shelter, casting a sickly glow across the cold concrete floor. The morning air held a sharp, antiseptic smell that couldn't quite mask the underlying sense of fear and despair. In the last cage of the long row, a small reddish-brown puppy pressed himself against the back wall, his thin frame trembling. Rusty, as the shelter staff had named him, had been marked for euthanasia. The red tag hanging over his kennel read 30 seconds, a cruel countdown to the end. His patchy fur revealed signs of neglect, and his wide brown eyes darted nervously between the shelter workers approaching with their sterile equipment. Just as the technician prepared the syringe, a flash of grey fur caught everyone's attention. A tiny tabby cat, barely more than a kitten, had somehow worked her claws through the bars of her cage. With surprising agility, she squeezed through and leaped directly into Rusty's kennel. The shelter workers froze, watching in amazement as the small grey cat, Willow, pressed herself against the terrified puppy. Rusty's trembling slowly subsided as she curled around him protectively, her green eyes fierce and determined. Marianne Holloway, who had been quietly organizing supplies nearby, stepped forward. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she watched the unlikely pair. "Wait," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "According to Section 4 of the shelter protocols, we need to reassess when there's any significant behavioral change or interaction." The technician looked up with irritation. "Ms. Holloway, we have a schedule to keep." "The protocol exists for a reason," Marianne insisted, her hands clasped tightly together to hide their shaking. "This kind of cross-species bonding is extremely unusual. We should document it properly." The technician sighed heavily and reached for the cage door. "Look, I understand you're attached, but—" "Is there a problem here?" The deep voice cut through the tension like a knife. Colton Briggs stood in the doorway, his imposing frame filling the space. His steel-grey hair was perfectly combed, his pressed shirt and slacks immaculate as always. The shelter director's cold eyes surveyed the scene, landing on Marianne with clear disapproval. "Sir." Marianne straightened her spine, fighting to keep her voice steady. "We've witnessed an extraordinary behavioral event. The protocols clearly state dash." "I wrote those protocols, Ms. Holloway." Briggs interrupted, his tone dismissive. "And I can assure you they don't apply here." He turned to the technician. "Proceed with the procedure." Marianne felt her throat tighten. "But sir, if you could just see—" "What I see," Briggs cut in, stepping closer, "is an employee overstepping her boundaries, again." His voice dropped lower, meant for her ears alone. "Remember your place here, Ms. Holloway. Volunteers are easily replaced." The threat hung in the air between them. Marianne forced herself to step back, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She watched helplessly as Briggs nodded to the technician to continue, but a spark of defiance had ignited in her chest. Throughout the rest of her shift, Marianne couldn't shake the image of Rusty and Willow, two innocent souls finding comfort in each other despite everything. As she went through the motions of her daily tasks, her mind worked frantically, forming a plan she knew was both necessary and dangerous. That night, long after the shelter had closed, Marianne's small car pulled into the dark parking lot. Her hands shook as she retrieved the spare key she'd copied months ago. Just in case, she'd told herself then. The security system was basic, designed more to keep animals in than people out, and she knew the code by heart. The shelter felt different in the darkness, the usual harsh lighting replaced by the soft glow of emergency exits. Marianne moved quickly, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. She found Rusty and Willow exactly where she'd left them, still huddled together in their shared cage. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice trembling as she unlocked the door. "I'm getting you out of here." Willow's green eyes gleamed in the darkness, watching Marianne carefully. The small cat seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, allowing herself to be gently lifted. Rusty required more coaxing, his fear making him hesitant, but Willow's presence seemed to give him courage. With both animals secured in her arms, Marianne made her way back through the shelter. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every small sound making her heart race. She knew what she was risking, her job, her reputation, possibly even legal consequences. But watching Willow nuzzle comfortingly against Rusty's neck, she knew she couldn't have done anything else. The night air felt like freedom as Marianne hurried to her car. She had prepared the back seat with blankets and a small carrier, just in case she found the courage to do what she knew was right. As she settled the animals inside, Rusty's tail wagged tentatively for the first time since she'd known him. Driving away from the shelter, Marianne's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The weight of what she'd done pressed heavily on her shoulders, But beneath the fear was a fierce determination. She glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing Willow and Rusty already dozing together on the blankets, and knew that whatever came next, she had made the right choice. The headlights cut through the darkness as Marianne drove away from everything familiar, away from the security of following orders and keeping her head down. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but she knew with absolute certainty that she could never go back to being the person who stood by and watched while innocent lives were thrown away. Marianne's hands shook as she unlocked the front door of her small ranch house, carefully balancing the cardboard carrier containing both Rusty and Willow. The clock on her living room wall showed 3:15 in the morning, and the house felt unnaturally quiet except for Rusty's rapid, shallow breathing. "It's okay, sweethearts. You're safe now," she whispered, setting the carrier down on her worn beige carpet. Her modest living room, with its second-hand furniture and faded family photos, wasn't much, but it was warm and secure, everything the shelter hadn't been. When she opened the carrier door, Willow emerged first, her small grey form moving with surprising confidence. The kitten immediately turned around, positioning herself protectively in front of the opening. Her green eyes remained fixed on Rusty, who cowered at the back of the carrier. "Come on, sweet boy," Marianne coaxed softly. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." Rusty's wide eyes darted around the unfamiliar space. A car passed outside, its headlights sweeping across the walls, and he pressed himself even further back, trembling violently. Willow mewed softly, reaching one tiny paw into the carrier toward him. The sight brought tears to Marianne's eyes. "You two really are something special, aren't you?" She sat cross-legged on the floor, giving them space while keeping watch. Minutes ticked by, marked only by the gentle ticking of her wall clock. Finally, encouraged by Willow's persistent presence, Rusty took his first tentative steps out of the carrier. The puppy's condition was even worse in the warm light of her home. His reddish-brown fur was dull and patchy, his ribs clearly visible beneath his skin. He startled at every small sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the settling of the house, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Each time Willow would press closer to his side, her small body offering comfort far beyond her size. Marianne's thoughts raced as she watched them. What she'd done wasn't just against shelter policy, it was illegal. She'd stolen county property, as they would see it. Her stomach churned as she imagined Colton Briggs's face when he discovered the empty kennels in the morning. "What have I done?" she whispered to herself, running trembling fingers through her disheveled hair. Everything she'd worked for, her reputation, her job, her ability to help other animals, it could all be gone by sunrise. A soft whimper drew her attention back to Rusty. He had pressed himself against the wall, with Willow standing guard in front of him. The kitten's tail was slightly puffed, her stance protective despite her tiny size. The sight strengthened Marianne's resolve. No matter what came next, she couldn't have left them there to die. Sleep was impossible. Marianne spent the remaining hours before dawn setting up makeshift beds using old towels and blankets, placing water bowls in easily accessible spots, and trying to coax Rusty to eat some softened kibble she kept for emergency foster cases. The puppy wouldn't touch the food, though Willow managed a few cautious bites. The phone call came at exactly 8:30 in the morning. Marianne's hands trembled as she saw the shelter's number on her caller ID. Taking a deep breath, she answered. "Ms. Holloway." Briggs's voice was cold as ice. "Would you care to explain why 2 animals are missing from our facility? Animals that were logged as county property?" Marianne's throat went dry. "Mr. Briggs, This is theft, Ms. Holloway. Pure and simple. The shelter board has already been notified, and we're preparing to take legal action. That puppy was scheduled for humane euthanasia, and the kitten was under mandatory holding. You had no right." They were going to die! Marianne burst out, her voice breaking. That kitten saved his life, and you were still going to kill them both. The law is clear on this matter. Briggs continued, his tone unnervingly calm. Return the animals immediately, and we might consider not pressing charges. Marianne looked over at where Rusty and Willow were huddled together in a corner. The kitten had somehow convinced the terrified puppy to lay down, and she was pressed against his side, her small body rising and falling with each breath. I can't do that, Mr. Briggs. I'm sorry. Then you leave us no choice. Expect to hear from our lawyers. The line went dead. Marianne sank to the floor, her legs no longer able to support her. The magnitude of what she'd done crashed over her like a wave. Her savings were minimal, barely enough to cover a few months of expenses. How could she possibly fight legal charges? A strange sound pulled her from her spiral of panic. Rusty had started making an odd wheezing noise, his small body shaking with each labored breath. Willow was pawing at him anxiously, meowing in distress. Rusty! Marianne crawled closer, her heart pounding. The puppy's eyes were glazed, and when she carefully touched his head, she could feel the heat radiating from him. His fever was dangerously high. No, 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 she muttered, quickly gathering him in her arms. Willow jumped up onto her shoulder, refusing to be separated from him. Rusty felt limp and burning hot against her chest, his breathing becoming more labored by the minute. The reality of the situation hit her hard. Rusty needed immediate veterinary care she couldn't afford, especially now. The shelters would report her to every vet in the county. Even if she found someone willing to treat him, the bill would be astronomical. Yet looking down at the sick puppy in her arms, with the fierce little kitten keeping desperate watch, Marianne knew she had no choice. She had brought them into this world of warmth and safety. She couldn't let them down now. Somehow, she would find a way to save him. Rusty's wheezing grew worse, each breath a struggle. Willow pressed her small face against his neck, her green eyes full of worry. The bond between them, forged in the darkest moments of the shelter, seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. Their connection had given Marianne the courage to act. Now it gave her the strength to face whatever came next. She grabbed her phone and car keys, cradling Rusty close as she headed for the door. The puppy's fever was spiking, his small body burning against her chest. Time was running out, and she had no idea where to turn for help. But giving up wasn't an option, not when these two had shown such extraordinary courage in the face of death itself. Marianne watched helplessly as Rusty lay curled in a tight ball on her living room floor, his small body trembling with fever. Willow pressed against him, her grey tabby form a constant guardian, but even her presence couldn't ease his labored breathing. The morning sun filtered through threadbare curtains, casting weak shadows across the worn carpet as Marianne paced, her cell phone clutched tightly in her hand. She knew she needed help, real medical help. But who could she trust? Regular vets would ask questions she couldn't answer. Then, like a faint echo from her childhood, she remembered her father talking about Harlan Givens, the old farm veterinarian who lived on the outskirts of town. Harlan owes me one, her father had said years ago, the memory surfacing with sudden clarity. Helped him out of a tight spot back in '82. Never forgot it, that one. Marianne's fingers trembled as she looked up his number in the county directory. The phone rang 5 times before a gruff voice answered. Yeah, Dr. Givens. This is Marianne Holloway, Tom Holloway's daughter. There was a long pause on the other end. Tom's been gone 3 years now. Yes, sir, I know. Marianne swallowed hard. But I remember Dad saying you owed him a favor. I need help. Not practicing anymore. Harlan's voice was flat, dismissive. Try the clinic in town. Please. Marianne's voice cracked. I can't go to them. This puppy, he's very sick, and I can't explain where he came from. Dad said you were the one person he could always count on." Another lengthy silence filled the line. Marianne could hear Rusty's wheezing getting worse. "Bringing up your daddy's name to leverage a favor," Harlan finally growled. "That's pretty low." "I wouldn't if I weren't desperate," Marianne admitted. "He's dying, Doctor. Givens, please." She heard him exhale heavily. "Fine. Bring him out. But this makes us even. You understand?" 20 minutes later, Marianne pulled her old Honda into the gravel driveway of a weathered farmhouse. Rusty lay bundled in a blanket on the passenger seat, with Willow perched protectively on the dashboard, refusing to be left behind. Harlan Givens stood on his front porch, looking exactly as she remembered from her childhood. Tall, wiry, wearing a faded work shirt and scuffed boots. His face was more lined now, his hair grayer, but his eyes were just as sharp as they studied her approach. "That the pup?" he asked as she carefully lifted Rusty from the car. He didn't wait for an answer, turning abruptly. "Bring him inside." The interior of Harlan's house smelled of coffee and leather, with one room clearly converted into a makeshift examination space. Old medical equipment lined the walls, and a sturdy metal table stood in the center. "Put him there," Harlan instructed, pulling on latex gloves. His movements were efficient, professional, despite his earlier reluctance. As Marianne placed Rusty on the table, Willow leaped up beside him, her green eyes fixed warily on Harlan. "Cat stays with him, I take it." Harlan raised an eyebrow. "They're bonded," Marianne explained. "She won't leave his side." Harlan began his examination, his hands gentle despite his gruff demeanor. "Where'd you get him?" Marianne hesitated. "I can't say. County shelter, I'd guess," Harlan said without looking up. "Seen this kind of neglect before. Malnutrition, respiratory infection. Probably been sick for weeks with no treatment." Marianne's silence confirmed his suspicion. "You do realize stealing county property is a criminal offense?" His voice was neutral, clinical, as he listened to Rusty's chest with his stethoscope. "They were going to kill him," Marianne whispered. "Right there in front of me. Willow broke into his cage and I couldn't let them." Harlan's hands paused for just a moment. Then he reached for his medical bag, pulling out various supplies. "Going to need antibiotics. Fluid therapy. Could take a few days to turn him around." "You'll help?" Marianne's voice caught with relief. "Didn't say that." Harlan grumbled, but he was already preparing an injection. "Just stating facts. Hand me that fourth line." For the next hour, Harlan worked steadily, his movements precise and practiced. He administered medications, set up a fluid drip, and cleaned Rusty's matted fur with surprising gentleness. Through it all, Willow remained stationed at Rusty's head, occasionally touching her nose to the puppy's face as if checking on him. "Never seen anything quite like that," Harlan commented, nodding toward the cat. "Usually have to separate them during treatment." "She saved his life," Marianne said softly. "When they were about to, she just knew. Broke right through her cage to get to him." Harlan's weathered face softened, almost imperceptibly. "Animals surprise you sometimes, show more humanity than humans do." As he worked, Marianne noticed subtle changes in his demeanor. The initial resistance gave way to focused determination, and occasionally, when he thought she wasn't looking, his hand would rest comfortingly on Rusty's head. "Temperature's coming down," he announced after checking the thermometer. "Still not out of the woods, but responding to treatment. Need to monitor him for the next 24 hours. I can take him home." Marianne started, but Harlan cut her off. "No, you can't. He needs regular medication and monitoring. He stays here." He avoided her grateful look. "Just making sure your daddy's favor wasn't wasted. Nothing more." Marianne watched as Harlan carefully transferred Rusty to a padded bed in the corner, Willow following like a small grey shadow. The old veterinarian's hands were surprisingly tender as he adjusted the IV line and checked the puppy's breathing one more time. "You can come back tomorrow morning," he said gruffly. "Bring some decent coffee. That fancy stuff from the store in town. None of that instant garbage." It wasn't until Marianne was driving home, her heart lighter than it had been in days, that she realized what had happened. In Harlan Givens, she had found more than just medical help. She had found an ally, however reluctant he might be. His gruff exterior couldn't quite hide the compassion she'd glimpsed, especially when he thought no one was watching. As she pulled into her driveway, her phone buzzed with a text from Harlan. "Puppy's resting. Cat won't shut up. Bring treats tomorrow too." Despite everything, she smiled. Sometimes help came from the most unexpected places, wrapped in the roughest packaging. Marianne sat at her kitchen table, hands trembling as she spread out the shelter documents Harlan had helped her obtain through his old connections at the county office. The papers told a story that made her stomach turn. Column after column of numbers revealed a pattern she couldn't ignore, dates, times, and reasons for euthanasia that didn't add up. "This can't be right," she whispered, reaching for her calculator. Willow perched on the edge of the table, her green eyes fixed on the papers as if she understood their gravity. In the living room, Rusty dozed on his new bed, finally recovering thanks to Harlan's treatment. The more Marianne dug through the records, the clearer the pattern became. The shelter's euthanasia rates had skyrocketed since Briggs took over 3 years ago. But it wasn't just the numbers. It was the timing. Every spike in shelter deaths corresponded with expansions at Briggs's private breeding facility just outside the county line. "He's been killing them to free up resources," she said, her voice cracking. "Perfectly healthy animals, just like Rusty." She looked at the sleeping puppy, remembering how close he'd come to becoming another statistic. The sound of tires on gravel snapped her attention to the window. A county vehicle pulled into her driveway, its official markings glinting in the afternoon sun. Panic surged through her chest as 2 uniformed animal control officers stepped out. Marianne scrambled to gather the papers, shoving them into a folder. Willow leaped down, racing to Rusty's side as if sensing the danger. The knock at the door echoed through the house like a gunshot. "Ms. Holloway?" a stern voice called. "This is County Animal Control. We need to speak with you regarding stolen shelter property." Her hands shaking, Marianne pulled out her phone and dialed Harlan's number. He answered on the second ring. "They're here," she whispered, moving away from the door. "Animal Control. Briggs must have sent them." "Get out the back," Harlan's gruff voice commanded. "Bring everything, the animals and those papers. I'll meet you at the old Miller barn in 20 minutes. Another knock, louder this time. "Ms. Holloway, we have a warrant to search the premises." Marianne's heart pounded as she quickly gathered Rusty and Willow into their carriers. The puppy whimpered softly, but Willow's presence kept him calm. Grabbing the folder of evidence and her emergency bag, she slipped out the back door just as she heard the sound of a key in the front lock. The summer heat hit her like a wall as she hurried through her backyard, ducking under the clothesline and through the gap in the fence she'd discovered as a child. The carriers were awkward and heavy, but fear gave her strength. Behind her she could hear voices in her house, doors opening and closing. The old Miller barn stood abandoned at the edge of town, its weathered boards telling stories of decades gone by. Harlan's truck was already there when she arrived, the old veterinarian pacing impatiently by the door. "Get in," he ordered, helping her load the carriers into his truck. "I've got a place they won't think to look." As they drove down back roads, kicking up dust, Marianne clutched the folder of evidence to her chest. "Harlan, what I found, Briggs has been manipulating the system. He's been killing animals unnecessarily to redirect shelter resources to his private business." Harlan's weathered face hardened. I had my suspicions. That man's been poison to this county since he arrived, but proving it. It's all here, Marianne said, patting the folder. Dates, numbers, patterns. He marked Rusty for death, not because it was necessary, but because it was convenient. How many others died just to pad his pocket? They turned onto a narrow dirt road leading to Harlan's old farmhouse. The property sat well back from the main road, surrounded by fields that offered natural protection from prying eyes. You're in deeper than you know, girl, Harlan said as they pulled up to the house. Briggs has friends in the county office. This isn't just about saving 2 animals anymore. I know, Marianne replied, looking back at Rusty and Willow in their carriers. But I can't let him keep doing this. Those animals deserve better. The whole system needs to change. Inside Harlan's house, they settled the animals in a spare room. Willow immediately pressed against Rusty's side, her protective instincts as strong as ever. Marianne spread the documents across Harlan's kitchen table, explaining the patterns she'd discovered. See here? She pointed to a column of dates. Every time his kennel business expanded, the shelter's euthanasia rates doubled. He's been clearing space and redirecting supplies, medication, even staff time. The shelter's budget hasn't changed, but somehow there's never enough resources to save animals like Rusty. Harlan studied the papers, his expression growing darker. This goes beyond misconduct. This is fraud, abuse of power, misuse of county funds. A distant sound of vehicles on the main road made them both freeze. Through the window, they could see 2 county cars driving slowly past, their occupants scanning the surrounding properties. They won't think to look here, Harlan assured her. Not many remember I still live out here, but you'll need to lay low for a while. Marianne nodded, watching as Rusty and Willow dozed together in their makeshift bed. The sight strengthened her resolve. I won't let Briggs win, she said quietly. This isn't just about saving them anymore. It's about all the others who didn't make it, and all the ones still at risk. You're your father's daughter, all right, Harlan remarked, a hint of pride in his gruff voice. He never could stand by when things weren't right either. As evening settled over the farmhouse, Marianne began organizing the evidence into a clear, undeniable case against Briggs. The magnitude of what she'd stumbled into weighed heavily on her shoulders, but every time she looked at Rusty and Willow, she knew she had to see it through. Their survival wasn't just a miracle anymore. It was a call to action, a chance to expose the corruption that had cost so many innocent lives. The sound of more vehicles passing on the main road reminded them that their fight was far from over. But here, in the safety of Harlan's farmhouse, with the proof of Briggs's corruption spread before them and 2 survivors sleeping peacefully nearby, Marianne felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. Not just for Rusty and Willow, but for all the animals still trapped in Briggs's corrupt system. Marianne sat at her kitchen table, papers spread before her like pieces of a dark puzzle. The shelter documents Harlan had helped her obtain painted a disturbing picture. The morning light streaming through her window seemed to mock the grim reality revealed in those pages. Look at these numbers, she muttered, running her finger down another column. Willow sat perched on the corner of the table, her green eyes focused intently on the papers, as if she could read them herself. In his bed nearby, Rusty dozed peacefully, his chest rising and falling with each breath. The shelter's euthanasia rates had doubled since Briggs took over 3 years ago. But what caught Marianne's eye wasn't just the numbers, it was the pattern. Healthy animals marked for death, resources mysteriously reallocated, and a growing private kennel business on the side. Briggs wasn't just cutting corners, he was deliberately inflating death rates to funnel money and resources elsewhere. A knock at the door made her jump. Willow's ears flattened against her head as Marianne peered through the window. 2 county officials stood on her porch, their faces stern. "Miss Holloway," one called out, "we need to discuss the animals you removed from county property." Marianne's heart raced. She gathered the documents quickly, stuffing them into a folder. Willow leaped down, positioning herself protectively near Rusty's bed. "Just a moment," Marianne called back, buying time. She pulled out her phone and typed a quick message to Harlan. "Officials here. Need help." The knocking grew more insistent. "Miss Holloway, we have the authority to seize county property. Please open the door." Marianne's hands shook as she searched through more papers, looking for anything that might help her case. That's when she found it. A small manila envelope that had slipped between the other documents. Inside was a photograph that made her breath catch. The image showed a younger woman, perhaps in her early 20s, holding a tiny grey tabby kitten. The woman's eyes were bright and defiant, but what struck Marianne was the familiar stern face in the background. Colton Briggs, looking years younger but just as cold. Written on the back in faded ink, "Sarah and Willow, 2023. Marianne's mind raced. Sarah, she'd heard that name whispered at the shelter. Briggs's daughter, who'd left town under mysterious circumstances. And the kitten in the photo. There was no mistaking those sharp green eyes. She looked at Willow, who stared back with an uncanny intensity. "You're not just any stray," Marianne whispered. "You're his granddaughter's cat." The pounding on the door grew louder. Through the window, Marianne saw one of the officials speaking into a radio. She had minutes, maybe seconds. More papers spilled from the envelope. Letters, mostly. Correspondence between Sarah and various shelter workers. The story emerged in fragments. Sarah had worked at the shelter, witnessed her father's growing cruelty, tried to fight it. When she left town, she'd been forced to leave Willow behind, a final act of rebellion against her father's control. Willow wasn't just a random kitten who'd saved Rusty. She was living proof of Briggs's personal failure, a reminder of the daughter who'd rejected his methods. Her very survival threatened to expose the cracks in his carefully constructed image. The sound of a truck engine made Marianne look up. Through the back window, she saw Harlan's weathered pickup pulling into her yard. Without hesitation, she scooped up Rusty while Willow leaped into her arms. The documents went into her bag as she slipped out the back door. "Get in," Harlan growled, already opening the passenger door. "Those aren't just county officials out front. Briggs called in favors. They've got authority to search your property." As they drove away, Marianne cradled Rusty and Willow close. The photograph seemed to burn in her bag. Now she understood. This wasn't just about shelter policies or corruption. This was personal. Willow's presence was a living reminder of everything Briggs wanted to forget. "He's not just trying to cover up shelter deaths," Marianne said quietly. "He's trying to erase his own shame. Willow, she belongs to his daughter Sarah. The daughter who left because she couldn't stand what he was doing." Harlan's weathered hands tightened on the steering wheel. "That explains his fury. Man like Briggs, control is everything. Having his daughter's cat show up, saving another animal from his system, that's a threat to more than just his business." Marianne looked down at Willow, who had positioned herself protectively around Rusty even in her arms. The tiny grey cat's courage made sense now. She'd been born into this fight, a symbol of resistance against cruelty from the very beginning. "We need to find Sarah," Marianne declared. "She's the key to all of this. She must have more evidence, more proof of what her father's been doing." "Won't be easy," Harlan warned. "Briggs has connections all over the county, and now that he knows about Willow, he'll do anything to keep this quiet." Marianne stroked Willow's fur, feeling the cat's steady purr against her hand. "He's already doing everything he can to stop us. At least now we know why." She pulled out her phone, already searching for ways to track down Sarah Briggs. "We're not just fighting against the system anymore. We're fighting for the truth his own daughter tried to expose." As they drove through the Kentucky countryside, Marianne felt the weight of what they'd discovered. Willow wasn't just a brave little cat who'd saved Rusty. She was a living link to Briggs's past, a reminder of the humanity he'd tried to stamp out of his own family. Her survival wasn't just defiance. It was justice. The morning sun caught Willow's fur, making her grey coat shine like silver. In that light, Marianne could see the same defiant spirit that must have been in Sarah's eyes when she'd first held her kitten and decided to stand against her father's cruelty. Now that same spirit would help them expose the truth. Not just about the shelter, but about the man who'd tried to bury his own heart along with so many innocent lives. The autumn evening wrapped around Marianne like a cold blanket as she walked along the riverbank. Her mind raced with the day's discoveries about Willow's connection to Briggs, making the familiar path feel somehow different, more threatening. The Kentucky River flowed beside her, its waters dark and swift from recent rains. She'd taken this route home countless times, but tonight the shadows seemed deeper, more menacing. Rusty padded quietly beside her, while Willow rode perched on her shoulder, a habit the little cat had developed during their time together. The crunch of gravel behind her made Marianne's heart skip. Before she could turn, heavy footsteps surrounded her. 3 men emerged from the darkness, their faces hidden beneath baseball caps. She recognized one as Randy, Briggs's right-hand man from the shelter. "Evening, Miss Holloway." Randy's voice dripped with false courtesy. "Mr. Briggs sends his regards." Marianne clutched Rusty's leash tighter, backing away. "Leave us alone." "Can't do that. Boss wants his property back." Randy nodded to his companions, who moved to flank her. Rusty's fur bristled as he pressed against her legs. Even Willow arched her back, hissing from her perch. But their brave display couldn't mask their vulnerability. They were trapped between the men and the rushing river. "They're not property." Marianne's voice shook. "They're living beings who deserve—" Randy lunged forward, grabbing for Rusty's leash. The sudden movement sent Willow leaping from Marianne's shoulder with a yowl. In the chaos, one of the other men seized Rusty, who yelped in terror. The sound pierced Marianne's heart. It was the same frightened cry from his days in the shelter. "No!" Marianne fought back, but strong hands held her arms. She watched in horror as Randy gathered up the struggling animals. "Let's see how well they swim." Randy sneered. With cruel efficiency, he hurled first Rusty, then Willow into the churning river. The splash of their bodies hitting the water shattered the night. Without hesitation, Marianne wrenched free and dove in after them. The shock of the cold stole her breath as the current grabbed her, pulling her under. Breaking the surface, she gasped and searched frantically. "Rusty!" "Willow." Her voice was barely audible over the rush of water. Moonlight reflected off the choppy surface, offering brief glimpses of movement ahead. The current swept her downstream, her clothes weighing her down like lead. Through the spray, she caught sight of Rusty's reddish-brown fur. The small dog was struggling against the flow, Willow somehow clinging to his back, her grey fur plastered to her tiny body. "Hold on!" Marianne called out, fighting to reach them. The river pulled them all mercilessly, throwing them against hidden rocks and branches. Her muscles screamed with effort as she pushed through the water. Then something remarkable happened. Rusty, the trembling shelter dog who had cowered from his own shadow, turned back toward her. His eyes, once wide with constant fear, now blazed with determination. He paddled strongly against the current, Willow balanced on his back, making his way to Marianne. "Good boy," she gasped as his wet fur came within reach. "Brave boy." Rusty didn't just swim to her. He grabbed her sleeve in his teeth, pulling her towards the riverbank. The little dog's strength seemed to come from somewhere deep inside, some well of courage that had been waiting for this moment. Together, They fought the current. Marianne kicked with her remaining strength while Rusty guided them, Willow still somehow maintaining her grip on his back. The riverbank appeared closer with each desperate stroke. Finally, Marianne's feet found purchase on the rocky bottom. Stumbling, shivering, they dragged themselves onto the shore. They collapsed in a heap of wet fur and soaked clothing, their chests heaving with exhaustion. Marianne pulled both animals close, feeling their rapid heartbeats against her. Rusty's entire body trembled, but not from fear this time, from the tremendous effort he'd made to save them all. Willow, though drenched, began to purr, the sound raspy but strong. "You saved us," Marianne whispered, burying her face in Rusty's wet fur. "You brave, wonderful boy." The change in him was extraordinary. The terrified puppy who had waited for death in a shelter cage had become her protector, finding courage she never could have imagined. Through chattering teeth, she looked back toward where Briggs's men had been, but they were gone, perhaps assuming the river had finished their work for them. The bond between her and these two animals had been forged in trust and compassion. Now, tested by fire, or rather water, it had been transformed into something unbreakable. Rusty lifted his head and licked her face, his eyes clear and steady. He was no longer a victim. In saving her, he had also saved himself, shedding the last shadows of his fearful past. Willow pressed against them both, her usual fierce protectiveness now tinged with profound gratitude and pride for her canine companion. They huddled together on the riverbank, soaked and exhausted but alive. The night air was cold, but the warmth between them, a warmth born of love, courage, and survival, could not be extinguished. The morning light filtered weakly through the windows of Harlan's farmhouse kitchen, casting long shadows across the worn wooden table. Marianne sat wrapped in a thick blanket, her hands trembling slightly around a steaming mug of coffee. Her clothes were still damp, her hair a tangled mess, but she was alive. Beside her, Rusty lay curled up on an old quilt, his fur mostly dried but still matted from the river water. Willow, ever vigilant, remained pressed against his side, her grey tabby coat already neat and pristine again. Harlan paced the kitchen, his weathered face lined with anger. "Those men could have killed you," he growled, slamming his palm against the counter. "And the animals, throwing them in the river like that." His voice cracked with barely contained rage. "But they didn't succeed," Marianne said softly, reaching down to stroke Rusty's head. The puppy lifted his eyes to meet hers, and she saw something new there, a quiet strength that hadn't existed before. "Rusty saved us. He fought the current, kept us together. That doesn't make what Briggs did any less criminal," Harlan muttered. He stopped pacing and dropped heavily into the chair across from Marianne. "I've known something was wrong at that shelter for years, but I kept my mouth shut. Not anymore." Marianne watched as the old veterinarian pulled a thick manila folder from a nearby shelf. "What's that?" "Evidence," Harlan said grimly. "Been collecting it bit by bit. Didn't know what I'd do with it until now." He spread several documents across the table. "These are intake records from the shelter, the real ones, before Briggs doctored them. I made copies whenever I could." Marianne leaned forward, her eyes widening as she studied the papers. "These numbers, they don't match what's in the official reports at all." "Course they don't." Harlan's voice was bitter. "Briggs has been inflating euthanasia numbers for years, claims the shelter's overcrowded, needs more funding. Meanwhile, he's been quietly diverting those resources to his private breeding operation." "The Golden Meadows Kennel," Marianne whispered, remembering the glossy business cards she'd seen on Briggs's desk. "But how did you get these records?" Harlan's expression softened slightly. "Your father wasn't the only one who believed in doing what's right. I've had friends at the shelter. Good people who couldn't speak up themselves but knew someone should know the truth. Marianne sorted through more papers, her hands steadying as purpose replaced fear. Bank statements showed suspicious transfers. Veterinary records revealed healthy animals marked as unadoptable. Each document added another piece to the puzzle of Briggs's corruption. There's more, Harlan continued, pulling out his phone. I've got photos of the conditions at his kennel. Overcrowded runs, sick animals hidden from inspectors. And this… He handed Marianne a worn envelope. These are letters from Briggs's daughter, Sarah. She left them with Willow at the shelter. Marianne carefully opened the envelope, reading the pain and anger in every line. Sarah had discovered her father's scheme, threatened to expose him. In retaliation, he'd forced her to surrender Willow, using his influence to block any attempt she made to rescue her cat. No wonder he was so desperate to get rid of Willow. Marianne murmured. She's living proof of his cruelty, to animals and his own family. Rusty stirred at her feet, whimpering softly. Willow immediately pressed closer, and Marianne watched in amazement as the tiny cat began grooming the much larger dog, her rough tongue smoothing his fur with determined care. Look at them, Harlan said quietly. That's what Briggs can't understand. These animals aren't just property to be bought and sold. They're capable of more love and loyalty than he could ever imagine. Marianne nodded, feeling strength flow back into her tired body. So what do we do now? We fight, Harlan said firmly. I've got contacts at the state attorney's office, people who've been looking for a reason to investigate Briggs for years. With this evidence, plus what happened last night. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. But Marianne, you need to be sure. Going public means facing him head-on. He'll come at you with everything he's got. Marianne looked down at Rusty and Willow, remembering the terror of the dark water, the way Rusty had fought to save them all. I'm sure, she said. These animals risked everything to save me. I owe them the same courage. They spent the next hours organizing their evidence, creating copies, building their case. Harlan made calls to his contacts, speaking in low, urgent tones. Marianne documented her own experiences, writing down every detail of Briggs's threats and the attack at the river. As the day wore on, more allies emerged. A former shelter worker arrived with additional records. A local rescue organization offered statements about suspicious patterns they'd noticed. Even the night security guard who'd seen Marianne rescue Rusty and Willow came forward, willing to testify about conditions at the shelter. It's like a dam breaking, Harlan observed, watching another car pull up his long driveway. Once people know they're not alone in speaking up, the truth comes pouring out. Marianne sat cross-legged on the floor, Rusty's head in her lap. The puppy's breathing was steady now, his fear replaced by contentment. Willow patrolled the room's perimeter, her green eyes alert but calm. Looking at them, Marianne felt her own resolve harden into certainty. We're not just fighting for Rusty and Willow anymore, she said. We're fighting for every animal Briggs has hurt, every person he's threatened into silence. Harlan nodded, his gruff exterior softening as he watched her, with something like pride. Your father would be proud, you know. He always said you had more spine than anyone gave you credit for. Marianne felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were different from the desperate tears of last night. These were tears of determination, of purpose found. We're going to need legal help, she said, wiping her eyes. Someone who knows how to present all this evidence properly. Already on it, Harlan replied, holding up his phone. Got a call in to Sarah Miller. She's a prosecutor who specializes in fraud cases. Used to volunteer at the shelter herself, years ago. She's been looking for a way to take Briggs down for ages. As they worked, Marianne felt the last traces of her former timidity falling away. The woman who had quietly accepted the shelter's cruelty was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who understood that sometimes love meant fighting back. The sun was setting when they finally finished organizing their case. Folders of evidence lay neatly stacked, witness statements were recorded, and a clear timeline of Briggs's crimes had been established. Harlan's kitchen table had become a war room, covered in documents that told a story of years of systematic abuse and fraud. "First thing tomorrow," Harlan said. "We take this to the state attorney's office. No more waiting, no more hiding." Marianne nodded, gathering Rusty and Willow close. The puppy nuzzled her hand, his touch gentle but confident. Willow purred loudly, her small body vibrating with contentment. "Whatever happens next," Marianne said, "we face it together." The county courthouse loomed before Marianne, its limestone facade gleaming in the morning sun. She clutched her folder of evidence close, drawing strength from Harlan's steady presence beside her. Inside her car, safely parked nearby, Rusty and Willow waited with a volunteer from the local rescue organization. "Remember," Harlan murmured as they climbed the courthouse steps, "Briggs is counting on intimidation. Don't let him shake you." The courtroom was already packed when they entered. Marianne's heart jumped when she saw Colton Briggs at the defendant's table, his expensive suit a stark contrast to his thunderous expression. His lawyer, a sharp-featured woman in designer clothing, whispered urgently in his ear. Sarah Miller, the state prosecutor, met them at the plaintiff's table. "Are you ready?" she asked Marianne quietly. "Remember, stick to the facts. Let the evidence speak for itself." Judge Eleanor Matthews entered, her stern presence commanding immediate silence. After the preliminary procedures, Sarah rose to deliver her opening statement. "Your Honor, this case will prove that Colton Briggs systematically abused his position as shelter director, falsifying euthanasia records to embezzle county funds while operating an illegal private breeding operation. His actions resulted in the unnecessary deaths of countless animals and the misuse of taxpayer dollars." Briggs's lawyer countered with practiced smoothness. "These allegations are nothing more than the desperate attempts of a disgruntled former volunteer to discredit a respected public servant. Mr. Briggs has served this community for 15 years without a single complaint." The testimony began. Former shelter workers described the pattern of unnecessary euthanasia. Financial experts detailed the suspicious flow of money. Through it all, Briggs maintained an air of injured dignity, shaking his head at each new accusation. When Harlan took the stand, his gruff voice carried the weight of decades of veterinary experience. "I've treated animals from that shelter for years," he testified. "The pattern of neglect was systematic. Perfectly healthy animals marked for death while resources were diverted elsewhere." During cross-examination, Briggs's lawyer tried to paint Harlan as a senile old man with a grudge. But Harlan's responses were sharp and precise, his memory for details unassailable. Then came Marianne's moment. As she took the stand, her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. She described finding the falsified records, the pattern of corruption, and the night at the river when Briggs's men had tried to silence her permanently. "Miss Holloway," Briggs's lawyer said silkily, "isn't it true that you stole county property when you took those animals?" "I prevented an illegal execution," Marianne replied firmly. "Rusty was marked for death despite being young and healthy. Willow." She paused, looking directly at Briggs. Willow was abandoned at the shelter by Mr. Briggs's own daughter, a fact he tried to hide by having her destroyed. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Briggs's face darkened dangerously. "Your Honor," Sarah Miller interjected, "I'd like to call for a brief recess to bring in our final pieces of evidence." Judge Matthews nodded. 20 minutes. During the break, Marianne and Harlan hurried to the car. Rusty had grown significantly stronger in the weeks since his rescue, though he still stayed close to Willow's protective presence. Both animals seemed to sense the importance of the moment as they were led into the courthouse through a side entrance. When court resumed, Sarah Miller addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we'd like to present the actual victims in this case. These are the animals Mr. Briggs ordered to be euthanized without cause." Rusty and Willow were brought forward. The puppy's transformation was remarkable, his coat now glossy, his eyes bright with health instead of fear. But what happened next stunned the entire courtroom into silence. Without prompting, Willow jumped into Rusty's lap, and the puppy, once so traumatized he could barely move, gently nuzzled the tiny cat. Their bond was undeniable, a living testament to the connection Briggs had tried to destroy. Judge Matthews leaned forward, studying the pair intently. Even her judicial composure couldn't hide her reaction to their obvious devotion to each other. "Your Honor," Sarah Miller said quietly, "these animals were scheduled to die. Not because they were sick or dangerous, but because Mr. Briggs saw them as inconvenient evidence of his schemes. Their survival exposes the truth he tried to bury." Briggs's lawyer jumped up. "This is pure theatrics, Your Honor. These animals are irrelevant to the financial charges at hand." "On the contrary," Judge Matthews replied, her voice stern. "They represent the real cost of Mr. Briggs's actions, lives treated as mere numbers on a spreadsheet." The judge's ruling was unequivocal. Briggs was stripped of his position, ordered to pay substantial restitution, and referred for criminal prosecution. His carefully constructed world of corruption crumbled as reporters rushed to spread the story. "The court finds that Mr. Briggs has engaged in a systematic pattern of fraud and abuse of power," Judge Matthews declared. "His actions represent not just financial misconduct, but a fundamental betrayal of public trust and basic decency." As Briggs was led away by court officers, his face ashen with rage and humiliation, Marianne felt the weight of years lift from her shoulders. Rusty pressed against her leg, no longer trembling, while Willow sat regally on his back, green eyes gleaming with what looked remarkably like satisfaction. Harlan clapped her gently on the shoulder. "You did it, girl. You stood up to the biggest bully in the county and won." "We did it," Marianne corrected him, reaching down to scratch behind Rusty's ears. "All of us together." The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and supporters. Camera flashes caught the moment as Marianne emerged with Rusty and Willow, their presence living proof that sometimes the smallest creatures could help topple the mightiest walls of injustice. Sarah Miller joined them outside, her smile wide. "The state attorney's office is already moving to audit every shelter in the county. What you've done here will save countless lives." Marianne watched as Rusty playfully nosed at Willow, their fear now just a memory. In their victory, she saw the promise of change, not just for them, but for all the animals who would come after. The system that had almost destroyed them had been exposed, and in its place, something better could now grow. The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees surrounding Marianne's farmhouse as she watched Rusty race across the yard, his reddish-brown coat catching the late afternoon sunlight. 6 months had passed since the courtroom victory, and the transformation in the once terrified puppy was nothing short of miraculous. "Look at him go," Marianne whispered, a smile spreading across her face as Rusty bounded through piles of fallen leaves. Gone was the malnourished, trembling creature from the shelter. In his place ran a confident, healthy young dog, his tail held high and his eyes bright with joy. Willow perched regally on the porch railing beside Marianne, her grey tabby fur perfectly groomed and her green eyes tracking Rusty's every move. Though no longer needed as his protector, she remained his constant companion. Each night she still curled up next to him in his bed, their unlikely bond as strong as ever. "Hard to believe that's the same dog," Harlan commented, joining Marianne on the porch. The retired veterinarian had become a regular visitor, dropping by several times a week to check on his former patients. though they both knew the animals no longer needed medical attention. "Sometimes I have to remind myself this is real," Marianne admitted. "That we actually did it. We changed things." Indeed, the changes went far beyond their small family. The county shelter had undergone a complete overhaul. The new director, a compassionate woman with years of animal welfare experience, had implemented a no-kill policy. Adoption rates were up, and euthanasia numbers had plummeted. Marianne's fight had sparked a revolution in how the community treated its most vulnerable creatures. But the transformations weren't just external. Marianne felt the changes deep within herself. The timid volunteer who had once struggled to speak up had found her voice. Local media still sought her out for interviews about animal welfare issues. Schools invited her to speak about standing up for what's right. She had become someone whose opinion mattered, whose courage inspired others. "Dad told me what you did was pretty amazing," a deep voice called from the driveway. Marianne turned to see Nathan Givens, Harlan's son, walking up the path. He carried a basket of fresh vegetables from his organic farm, his regular excuse to stop by. Harlan huffed and made himself scarce, but not before Marianne caught the pleased glint in his eye. The old veterinarian had been not so subtly encouraging these visits from his son, though he'd deny it if asked. "Your father did just as much," Marianne replied, feeling the familiar warmth in her cheeks whenever Nathan was around. "I couldn't have done any of it without him." Nathan leaned against the porch railing, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Maybe, but you were the one brave enough to start it all." Rusty bounded up the porch steps then, pressing his nose into Nathan's hand in greeting. The dog who once cowered from strangers now welcomed friends with enthusiasm. Willow stretched lazily and jumped down to weave between Nathan's legs, marking him with her approval. "They've come so far," Nathan observed, scratching behind Rusty's ears. "Both of them. And you too." Marianne nodded, watching as Rusty flopped onto his back, belly up, the ultimate sign of trust. "We healed each other, I think. They showed me what courage looks like even when you're scared to death. And maybe I showed them that not all humans will hurt them." "You showed a lot of people a lot of things," Nathan said softly. His hand found hers on the railing, and this time, Marianne didn't pull away. The touch felt natural, right, like another piece of her new life falling into place. Inside the house, framed newspaper articles told their story. Local hero exposes shelter corruption. Justice prevails, animals find voice in Kentucky court. New era for county animal welfare. But the real story, Marianne knew, wasn't in the headlines. It was in the quiet moments like these, Rusty's joyful play, Willow's contented purr, the growing warmth between her and Nathan. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Marianne reflected on how far they'd all come. Rusty, once marked for death, now lived each day with boundless enthusiasm. Willow, the fierce little defender, had softened into a confident guardian who knew her family was safe. And Marianne herself, the invisible volunteer who had once swallowed her protests, had found not just her voice, but her purpose. "Stay for dinner?" she asked Nathan, surprising herself with her boldness. His smile was answer enough. "I'd like that." Rusty barked happily, as if seconding the invitation, while Willow wound herself around their ankles in approval. Inside, Harlan could be heard puttering in the kitchen, probably starting coffee despite having claimed he was leaving 10 minutes ago. The evening settled around them like a comfortable blanket. This was what justice looked like in the end. Not just the dramatic moments in courtrooms, but the quiet victory of lives restored, hearts healed, and love grown in the most unexpected places. Later, as they sat down to dinner, Marianne looked around her table. Harlan pretending not to be pleased that his son was there. Nathan stealing glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking. Rusty and Willow sharing space by the fireplace, the big dog and little cat still inseparable. This was her family now, born from that single moment of courage when she refused to let fear win. The world wasn't perfect. There would always be battles to fight, wrongs to right. But here, in this moment, watching Rusty dream peacefully with Willow curled against him, Marianne knew that sometimes courage is rewarded, sometimes justice prevails, and sometimes love really does conquer all. Thanks for watching. If any part of this story lingered with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here again tomorrow, sharing another tale that speaks to the soul.